Hello and welcome back. Today I've got something a little bit different on the agenda. I have had this little Christmas tree quilt mocked up for a little while, and it's one that I would like to make, but it's one that, because of the way I want to make it, doesn't lend itself as well to writing a pattern. I could do that, but I thought that it might be more fun just to take you guys along for the ride, see how this quilt turns out, kind of hear my thoughts, look at my math. Maybe you guys like the math. Probably most of you don't like the math, but we'll take a look at everything, and this video is going to be filmed over the course of maybe, I don't know, several days for sure, maybe several weeks, but you're going to get to see it all right up front. So what are we doing? Christmas tree quilt. As you can see, this is a 56-inch square log cabin type Christmas tree. But what I want to do is, instead of making it like what you see here, where it's kind of standard log cabin, I want to piece long strips. I'm talking hundreds of inches long, 2.5-inch strips with kind of scrap fabrics. I'm going to use a jelly roll, but this pattern, if it works as well as it does in my mind, is going to work really well for using up 2.5-inch pieces from your scrap bin, whether it's a 2.5-inch square or 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangle, 2.5 by 8.5, 2.5 by some crazy 7 3/8 inch. It's not going to matter what those measurements are, but rather what will matter is that we have the length that we need sewn together. So the approach is going to be a little bit different. So these will be just scrappy, sewn together bits. And then the white sections will be scrappy, sewn together white bits. I hadn't given thought to what I want these pieces to be, but we'll figure that out as we go. So today, what I want to do is, I've worked on the math a bit. I'll walk my way through that with you, and then I want to cut some of my strips. Now, I am going to use a jelly roll just because I have one on hand, and that is going to be an easy way to make this. So it can be a jelly roll quilt, but you could just as easily pull the colors from your scrap bin, and that could make a really fun, scrappy Christmas tree quilt. So let's start talking math. What we have here, we have a bunch of, well, 3 of these full color log cabin blocks. It's this block, and this block right here. And I have figured out what I need, what pieces I need per block. So I've just sort of written them up here, and I mocked everything up in Electric Quilt. If you're familiar with Electric Quilt, it is a quilt design program that you can pretty easily mock things up, drop your fabrics in, and get an idea for how things are going to look. So that's what I have used for all of my mock-ups here. And then I always do all of the math myself. I don't find that Electric Quilt works as well for doing the math, but I do like it for kind of planning things out. So I've written down all of the pieces that I will need per block. These are 14-inch finished blocks. And then per block, I need 104.5 inches times 3, gives me 313.5 inches that I need to complete these 3 blocks. So I have that number written here. And then we also need a bunch of these blocks. These are the half color, half white blocks. So 6 of those we need. And so I've again written down what I need for the colored portion of the blocks, and I come up with needing an additional 357 inches. I told you it was going to be a little mathy, but we'll get through the math part and get into the fun part. 357 inches here, which I've added to my 313, and come up with 670.5 inches. I've divided that by 40 inches, which is the length of my jelly roll strips. And I come up with, I need just under 17 strips, but this does not include my seam allowances. So I have, I'm gonna need a few more than 17. So I have that information tucked in my head. And then I did the same thing for the white portion of these blocks. Came up with 270 inches total is what I need, which is about 7 strips, again with no seams. So I'm not going to, figuring out the math on how much fabric we lose in the seams is going to depend on the width of your strips. So if I cut everything at 2.5 inches, I'm going to need a whole lot more fabric because I lose so much in those seams, as opposed to if I cut some at 2.5, some at 12.5, some at 9, that's going to take less fabric. So I'm just guesstimating that I'm going to need about 8 to 9 strips of the white and 18 to 19 strips of the color. That's what I'm going to start with, and then if I find that I need to add something to those strips, I can just piece some more chunks in there. So that's kind of where we are starting. So I'm going to open up this jelly roll and sort this a little bit, because I'm going to need not the whole thing. So 8 to 9 of white and then 18 to 19 of the color means I don't need all of these pieces. And again, this would be so fun to pull from your scrap bin, because it really doesn't matter how many strips you have. It just matters that you get the right length to be able to cut all the pieces that you need. All right, let's open this up. That's always fun to do, isn't it? Now, one tip that I should have utilized before opening this up: if you take a lint roller when your jelly roll is all nice and tidy in the little circle, run a lint roller over both of these sides. That is going to eliminate some of this fun mess we're going to have as we start working with this. All right, so there's what we look like. I'm going to lay it this way so that I can see all my different prints here. And I am looking for contrast. I know I'm going to start with my whites, just because those are so easy to see right here. So what have we got? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not sure about those two. I'm going to tuck those down there. So that was 7, 8, 9. That gives me 9 right there. And I'm pretty happy with those. So I think that's where I'm going to start with for my whites, these prints right here. Just going to set those to the side. Now, the reason that I opted not to keep these prints in with the whites is they have too much contrast, in my opinion, to play as well with these other fabrics for these portions. So I'm going to leave these out for right now and set those to the side. So those are going to be my white pieces. And then let's start looking at what we have here. I don't know if I want these lighter grays in there. I'm going to set them to the side just for a moment and debate about if I want those in there. I do have some of that stone here in my mock-up. That little sheep print right there, that light one, is actually this print right here. So I've included them in here, but I'm going to see what we end up with as we go down through. So what did I say I needed? About, where are you? 17 strips. So I think 18 to 19 is good. So those are duplicates. There's 2 of those in this bundle. So we'll pull out one of those. I can always add these back in if I want to. I'm uncertain about this one, so I'm going to set him to the side also. Again, you'll notice here, I do have some of the checks included in here, but I kind of also like when there's not a lot of white in this section, just because that gives me more contrast against these white portions. So as I'm choosing fabrics, I'm keeping that in mind. All of these I think are going to work great. Now, Starberry fabrics are in quilt shops right now. I've heard they're selling very quickly, so if you've had your eye on these fabrics, I would suggest purchasing them sooner rather than later so you don't miss out. They've been a lot of fun to work with. Okay, so I'm moving on to my reds here. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, so what I'm seeing here, if I wanted to use just the reds, greens, and blacks, leave out those stones, then what I'm seeing that I need would be 6 of each of those colors. So let's see what happens if I plan it that way. Move the check over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'd need to eliminate one of those, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'd eliminate a green also, and that would give me 18. And then maybe, what color do we want to add an extra strip in to get me up to the 19? We'll decide here. 7. I like all my blacks. Well, I need all those because those are 7. So we need to take out 1 green or 1 red, right? That makes sense in my head. Sometimes doing math on camera. Usually when I'm working on it myself, I very much just go over it in my head over and over to make sure that I have what I need. Let's see, what do we want to eliminate here? You know what? Maybe I'm just going to leave them all. How many does that give me? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 there. I think I said 7 red, so that's 14 plus 6 is 20, which would be plenty. So we'll get rid of these stones. We're going to go with these right here. That's going to give us plenty of fabric. I'm going to cut all of these up. And actually, I'm going to show you sort of how I'm going to approach the cutting on this. There you can see how linty we got. Jelly rolls are always messy. That lint roller tip is a good one if you want to avoid all of that. Okay, so I'm going to stack this into a pile of 6. And I am going to open it up. Make some space here. And then we're going to do some cutting. I'm going to mix up the colors because I don't think I'm going to cut each section quite the same, because I want there to be a variety of sizes in all of the colors. So let's just do, we'll do 2 each of every color. Get these cut down into little chunks. And then just start sewing them together. I'm hoping this is a pretty quick and fun project. I never know. Sometimes things seem quick and fun and simple in my head, and I start working on it, and there might be something I didn't anticipate, or something goes awry. It takes a little bit longer than I think. So we'll see what happens here. Okay, so this is my 6th strip right here. And we're just going to cut various sized pieces. I'm going to trim my selvage off and then start working my way across. I always use a 60mm rotary cutter. Most people, I think, prefer the 45s, but you will often find me using a 60. I'm going to start with 2.5, and then let's see, this is a 3.5 right here. Just going to do various sizes. They don't even have to be, you know, they wouldn't even have to be, right now I'm doing all even, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, but I could do something different. These can be any sizes. There's no certain sizes they have to be. I do want some longer ones though. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's do an 8.5 here. Maybe a 10.5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Sometimes it's easier to count over like that rather than to math in my head to see what the actual number would be. Math in your head. We want to enjoy our cutting and not have to think too hard if we don't have to. So that's what I have here. And then we'll just go with that. Now I think in my next batch of strips, I am going to want to make sure that I get some longer ones, because these go all the way up to 14.5, so I might as well utilize some longer strips. I'm just going to trim the selvage here on this one. Line these back up from getting moved around. Trim those off here. Okay, so that's what I have so far cut. And I'm just going to continue doing that for these next few pieces and get a variety of strips in different sizes. And then we start sewing. So let me get these cut up and touch base here in just a minute. finished up my cutting, and I definitely need to change my blade on my cutter. It was giving me a little bit of a fuss there every now and then. So I'm gonna do that as soon as I'm done chatting with y'all here. I've got my whites all done in a variety of sizes and all of my colors done in a variety of sizes. And now the next thing that I need to do is sew all of my whites together. I'm just going to mix up the prints, sew them in random order, and I need 270 inches. So once I get there, that's the length I'm shooting for. And I will do the same thing with all of my colored prints. For those, I'm looking for about 670 and a half. Now, it doesn't need to be exactly that, but it needs to be at least that long once it's sewn together, because then the next step will be to cut these all up into, you know, my 2.5 by 2.5, 2.5 by 4.5, whatever the actual measurements are that I need to construct my log cabin blocks. They're just going to be super scrappy log cabin blocks, which I think could be really fun. We'll see how it works out. That's my next step, sewing all these together. So I am going to get to work on that. I'm sure that's going to take me a little bit of time. I'm going to get those sewn together, probably go ahead and, I don't know if I'll cut those up into the sizes before I touch base with you again or not, but get cracking on it. Be back chatting with you in just a few days' time with my progress, and we'll see where we're at then. It has been a couple days since we last chatted. We had a super busy weekend, a fun family get together, and my daughter was in town after being out of town for a few weeks. She's actually out of town for the summer, and I didn't know if she was gonna be able to come back home. So it was an unexpected trip back home. So we got to visit with her, and that was fun. So it has been a few days since we last chatted, but I had a chance to get most of my strips cut down into the pieces that I need for my blocks. And I wanted to share just my last little bit of cutting so that you could see how I am approaching the cutting on these. What I am paying attention to as I cut is making sure that all of my pieces have seams in them. I want them to be super patchworky, and it is really easy if you don't pay attention to end up with a piece that doesn't include piecing if you don't pay attention. So I wanted to show you how I'm doing that. This piece here, for example, if I would have cut out the 2.5 inch square or the 2.5 by 4.5 inch strip, I would not have any piecing in it. So it's just something I'm really paying attention to as I am cutting these different pieces. So let me go ahead and move some of this out of the road so I can show you what I'm doing. I have a few more of these colorful strips to cut. One in the 2.5 inch size, 2.5 by 4.5 by 6.5 by 8.5, 10.5, and 12.5. So one of each of those sizes. What I do is I take both ends of my strip and just lay them on my cutting mat so that I can choose which strip to cut my piece from. And I'm not going necessarily in order, 2.5, 4.5, 6.5 in length, but rather which piece is going to be the prettiest patchwork piece and have nice seams in it placed nicely as I cut. So as you can see, if I were to cut my 2.5 inch piece from either one of these chunks right here, neither one of them would have a nice patchworky bit like what you see here. We've got a nice patchwork 2.5 inch square cut like that. So I don't want to start with that. In fact, both of these pieces are going to work better with some of the longer cuts. 8.5 is going to come right up through here. So we'll just cut an 8.5 off of this one. That gives me a nice patchwork 8.5 inch strip. And we'll do a 10.5 down here on this one because that's going to give a nice 10.5 inch strip. Right there, so 8.5 and 10.5. Kind of got to keep track of what you've cut a little bit doing it this way when we're not cutting them in order, but by laying them out there, I can see what I have. So one of these I'm going to use this bottom one for my 12.5 inch piece, maybe. Yeah, let's do that. So 12.5 is over here. The other thing that I am paying attention to is where my seams lie as I am cutting my pieces. So this piece up here, for example, if I would be cutting, I'm not cutting any 11.5-inch strips, but if I were, the 11.5 falls right like this. And so I would not want to make this cut. I take that back. I wouldn't want it to fall on this side of my piece because then when I go to sew over here, there's just going to be a teeny little bit left of this fabric. It's even worse if it's just a little bit closer because it just, you run into the seam here. So I want to make sure that when I'm cutting, that I am cutting at least 1/2 inch away from my seams. So that's something to keep in mind too when you are cutting these pieces. But we're doing 12.5 down here. So I'm going to cut that one. And so now I'm needing a 6.5, a 4.5, and a 2.5. This one might work for my 6.5. Yeah, it's going to fall right here, which gives a nice amount of that sheep fabric there. I'm going to use that for my 6.5. Right there. Let's see what this one looks like with the 4.5. All right, so this is an example of what I might not want. My 4.5 falls right here. It's pretty close. I could cut it here, but I'm only going to have a 1/4 inch left after that seam is there. So that is not ideal. So rather than cutting like this for my 4.5, I'm going to slide this over a little bit. And I do have, this is how much fabric I have left over. I have a couple strips I cut that I'm not going to end up using. So I do have a little bit of extra fabric to work with. So I can trim this edge off here. And then when I cut my 4.5, it's going to have that seam placed just a little bit nicely. A little bit nicely, a little bit nicer. There's my 4.5. And then I need a 2.5, and I'm going to do the same thing again because I'm not happy. If I cut either one of these at the 2.5, it's just not going to have any patchwork. And that's exactly what I don't want. So I'm just going to slide this one over. We'll go about right there, trim this edge off, and then my 2.5 over here. And then I've got a nice little patchwork 2.5-inch square. Right there. So those were the last pieces that I needed. That is how I cut up all of them. Most of the time I did not need to do any trimming off of ends. Occasionally I did, but just having the option to choose between those two strips where those seams were going to lay the nicest, fall the nicest, and then making sure that I didn't have seams too close to the end of a strip. I was able to do that pretty easily using that method without having to do a lot of trimming off of any of those strips. And that is how I approached cutting for all of these strips. The next step is going to be to start sewing them together into my log cabin blocks, which that should go pretty quickly. We don't need a lot. 3 of this right here, and then 6 of this kind right here. And then we're going to be ready to start assembling this quilt. So the next time we touch base, I should have all of these turned into blocks. It's been a few weeks and I have some block progress to share with you. I have sewn together all of the blocks that I had planned to sew, and they are have turned out quite a bit different than what I thought. I really thought that these were going to look much more log cabin-esque than they actually are. This block, the white and darks, does look fairly log cabin-y, but it's still much more patchworky than I thought it was going to be. You could probably tell that it's assembled log cabin style. However, these blocks over here, they do not really look log cabin-y at all. They just mostly look patchworky, which is interesting, but it doesn't look like a log cabin. It looks more like a crumb block, which has been fun and interesting to see. I've said interesting a lot of times. You can tell I think this is interesting, but it's been fun to see how these turn out because it's just not what I thought as I started making this quilt. What I have discovered is these blocks are going to be a lot of fun to use in a different way, because now they become just a wonderful approach to a fantastic scrap busting block. Basically looks like a crumb block, but it was a really nice way to assemble them because I had a plan. My pieces were cut. It's all assembled log cabin style. Log cabins are fairly simple blocks to make, and it just became a really fun block. So that has been fun to see. The next step for me is going to be to put these blocks together, and I'm thinking that I'm going to leave the background in white chunks. So this would be the top of my tree here. Let me adjust that a little bit. And then it would have white background on either side here. And then these patchwork blocks come in the middle here and form the next part of our tree. Let me just lay it out a little bit here so you can kind of see how it's gonna come together. And then you put another one of these little guys on this side. And then, I just need to cut and add those background pieces to the sides of my tree. It's just gonna be 4 blocks across. It's 4 rows down. So it should come together pretty fast. And all in all, it's been a fun little experiment to make these blocks. I like the direction it's going, but as I said, it is interesting how different these blocks have turned out than I thought. So the next thing I need to do is get these sewn together and be back here hopefully very soon with my completed Christmas tree quilt top. Hello and welcome back. I have an update on the Jelly Roll Christmas tree quilt. It's been about a week since I last chatted with you, and we have a finished quilt top. So as you can see, I decided that I definitely needed to do patchworky bits for those whites all around. And then down here at the bottom, same down there, I thought they needed the white patchwork as opposed to just solid white like I was talking about. The solid white was just going to look ridiculous. I laid it out on my design wall, and as soon as I saw those white spaces, I knew, yes, we definitely need some white patchwork. So let's take a look at this, and I'm going to give you my final thoughts on piecing this quilt. Oh, one thought before I put it down on the cutting table. I think this would be super cute if it had a little red star at the top of my Christmas tree. Now I am opting to skip the red star because I am ready to move on to another project, but I think it would be really cute. Plus that would make it rectangular, which would be nice. If I were going to add the red star, I would do 4 more of the white patchwork, put that across the top, and then just do an appliqued red star. That way I could continue the same patchworky look. You could do it with like an Ohio star or a sawtooth star or something like that at the top, but it would be easiest just to do more white patchwork blocks and then applique that red star on top. All right, so thoughts on piecing this quilt. First of all, it did not turn out log cabin-y at all. I thought that it was going to look a lot more log cabin-y, that these blocks were going to have a log cabin look. They do a little bit here. I think you could probably tell that these are log cabin blocks, but in general, they definitely look just more like scrappy patchwork, maybe crumb blocks, something like that. Let's see, next thought. I would put far less planning into this project, knowing how the blocks go together and how everything comes together as a whole. So you'll remember, I mean, you've just been watching this for a few minutes probably. For me, it's been, I bet I started filming this at least a month, 2 months ago, but I put all of that effort into the math and planning out how long my strips needed to be, which was great for me to know that I could use a jelly roll. But when I added these white pieces, I needed more fabric, so I ended up cutting from scraps anyways, but it was nice to know that I could get my initial plan all from a jelly roll. All of the dark prints are from a jelly roll, but then the new white blocks that I just pieced this past week, I did have to cut from my stash. So what I think I would do going forward if I were to make more blocks of these, and I do think this is a really fun block, and it's definitely a great scrap busting block, and it would be a block that I would do again, but the way I would approach it would be just kind of knowing roughly how much fabric I need for one block. So for example, this is my little diagram and my math here for the blocks that were, you know, either all color, these ones here in the center, or all white, like this one here. This is the math here. So I knew that each log cabin block was going to take 104.5 inches. Knowing that information is really helpful because that means you could just sew together a bunch of scraps. You know you're going to need a little bit more than that because of your seams, but not exactly how much more, because if you use smaller pieces in your initial long strips before you cut down into your log cabin subcuts, then if those pieces are smaller that you're using, you're going to need more of them because you're going to lose more in your seams when you're sewing those together. So, but roughly, you know, you're going to need about 105 inches plus for each block. So you could just start sewing together your scraps, and before you know it, you're going to have a long strip, and then you're just cutting down into your little subcuts. I did like this way of putting these blocks together, this log cabin style, because it was an easy way to do it. It looks much more scrappy than you would think, and I really do like the outcome, but definitely less planning required than what I had originally thought. A great scrap buster, because we're just looking at 2.5 inch squares, or rather 2.5 inch by various widths, and it was really easy. The other thing, as I made the white ones, I worried much less about where my seams fell. I realized that, you know, once they're all sewn together like this, you don't really notice a lot about where seams fell. You remember I shared about my cutting and how I was so specific about where those seams, I didn't worry about it for these. I didn't worry if I had seams in that center part, and just sort of let it be how it wanted to be. Another thought, I'm really enjoying this coriander colors polka dot mixed in with starberry. I also have the black with white dots that I really like mixed in with it. So that was fun adding those in here on these outer blocks. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was working entirely from the jelly roll, because that is a different fabric line. Also, if you have pieces left over from your scrappy Irish chain, those were all 2.5 inches. So I pulled some of those pieces that I had left over. You'll remember I made my scrappy Irish chain smaller than the pattern originally called for. So I pulled in some of those. That was fun to add those in. Jelly roll was a good starting point, but again, I had to add to it because of these outer white blocks. And then the other thing I did want to share, if you do want to make one of these for yourself, I shared a lot of this information, the notes that I made for doing the colored blocks and then the half and half blocks earlier. So to finish out the Christmas tree with the patchwork, what I did was I made, well, actually I made seven more of this size log cabin block. These finish at 14 inches. So these were all full blocks here. And then these two down here were slightly smaller than full blocks. They were trimmed to 12.5 by 14.5. So I made the full 14.5 and then just trimmed them down. And then for these right here, these two, those were 7.5 by 14.5. So I made the 14.5 and then I just added an extra 2.5 inch strip on the one side. And then that gave me enough that I could cut those into two rectangles, 7.5 by 14.5. And let me show you, you'll see those right here. So they would both have just a slightly skinnier strip on a portion. So right there. And then over here on this side, this one has a little bit skinnier here and here. You can kind of see, but it just mixes in with the rest of the patchwork and you don't even think about it that those are, you know, narrower strips there. So that worked out well. And then the last thing is the tree trunk itself was 4.5 by 14.5. So with all of the information I gave you at the beginning of the video, plus this new information, you would be able to make this on your own. And if it was me and I was doing this again, I would just sew together a whole bunch of white strips, 2.5, you know, cut your little pieces like I talked about at the beginning, but then sew them together in long strips for a while and then subcut what I need for the blocks and then do the same thing for the dark prints. cut down your little chunks, sew it into long strips, and then trim down what you need for blocks. And then when you run out of your long strip, just add some more pieces in. I think that'd be a really easy way to approach this. You don't necessarily need to have things figured out in advance as much as I did. It does help, like I said, knowing about how much-ish you're going to need for your blocks, but overall, much less planning than I probably needed to do. But I'm happy with the way it turned out. It was a fun experiment, and now I know how fun these blocks would be just to make patchwork. Like, just do a whole bunch of patchwork colors. Like, just imagine pulling out of your scrap bin all colors and mixing it all together. It would be just a great scrap buster and pretty easy to do. Not a lot of thinking involved. Just sew your pieces together, cut them into those log cabin sizes, the little chunks that you need, you know, 2.5 by 2.5, 2.5 by 4.5, by 6.5, by 8.5, 10.5, 12.5, and 14.5. So 2.5 by all of those measurements. Once you have your long strips cut up, and then just sew your log cabins together. It's really easy. So that is my fun little experiment. You'll have to let me know what you think. Let me know if you think it would be fun. We could do like an impromptu sort of scrappy log cabin block sew along, you know, like real impromptu, kind of Scrappy Irish Chain-esque. If you remember that one, you might still be working on that one, where it's just sort of, you know, throw these blocks in every now and then when you feel like making some, and before you know it, you have enough to complete a quilt. If that's something you think would be fun, I might be up for that. I know I certainly have scraps in my scrap bin that would work really well for this project, and definitely could be benefited from having less scraps. So that could be fun. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little bit of a different format, a little bit of a different way to approach a project, but I know I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed watching as well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your questions, comments, and I will catch you again next time.